My name is Tessa Lang, and I was 27 the night my parents brought me to dinner so they could tell me I was adopted. My mother actually smiled when she said they'd only kept me because the paperwork came with money, and now that I was no longer bringing in value, I was basically done. My father slid a stack of papers across the tablecloth like he was handing over a receipt. They had already started the process to cut me out of everything. I didn't cry. I didn't say a word for almost a full minute. But here's the part they never saw coming. Half a year before that dinner, I had found my birth family, and that night, I had placed them 3 tables behind my mother's chair. She just hadn't turned around yet. What happened when she finally did is why I'm here telling you this story years later. Welcome back, everyone. This is one of those quiet family stories that turns sharp in the worst possible way, about boundaries, dignity, and the moment somebody finally stops shrinking to fit a place they were never truly given. If you've ever had to fight just to be treated like you belong at your own table, this one will hit hard. And if you want stories like this, stay with me. The restaurant was called Ellery House, and I had never once been brought there before. My mother picked it, which should have told me everything. Marlene Lang never spent extra money unless there was a reason hidden somewhere under it. She showed up in a dark wool jacket she usually saved for court hearings and funerals. My father, Grant, had put the reservation under her name instead of mine, and I noticed because the host asked and he answered before I could open my mouth. There were no balloons, no cake waiting in the back, no awkward happy birthday candle in a dessert nobody had asked for. The table looked too clean, too careful, too empty. The whole night had the stiff feel of a meeting where somebody was about to be told bad news. I had spent years in rooms like that. I'm a probate paralegal, so my job is helping people sort out the ugly practical parts of death, money, and family. I know the difference between a dinner and a warning. This one felt like a warning. So I did what I always do when a room starts to feel wrong. I watched everything. I watched the exits. I watched my mother's hands. I watched the way my father kept clearing his throat, like he wanted to speak but couldn't quite make himself do it. That was when I noticed the little brass table marker behind us and slightly to the left, Table 14. I held on to that detail without knowing why yet. Just one of those things your mind saves for later because it thinks you're going to need it. I set my own folder on the table beside my water glass. Thin, plain, nothing flashy. My mother glanced at it like she assumed it was something harmless, maybe work papers or a card. She had no idea what I'd already put inside. You have to understand what birthdays were like in my house if you want to understand why none of this shocked me as much as it should have. When I was little, my birthday meant one cupcake from the grocery store, not a party, not a family gathering, just one sad little cupcake with a tiny candle stuck in it, sitting on the kitchen counter while my mother answered work calls and forgot it was there. Meanwhile, a few weeks later, my cousin Nolan would get a rented bounce house, a caterer, and little trays of fancy appetizers because Nolan was real blood, and everyone seemed to know that mattered. I remember asking when I was about 9 if I could have a party too. My Aunt Sandra was in our kitchen, drinking my mother's coffee, and she answered before my mother even had to. "We really only manage one nice thing at a time," she said, like she was being gentle. That was what stayed with me. How softly people can tell you you're lesser. How kind they can sound while they explain your place. So I learned to do the math early. One cupcake costs less than a party. A child who asks for less is easier to keep. By the time I was 10, I stopped asking. I told myself that being low maintenance was a skill, that it was practical, that it made me easier to love. It took me years to realize I was just making myself cheaper. I moved out the week I turned 19, with 2 overstuffed bags and an acceptance letter to a local college I'd filled out myself. Nobody drove me. Nobody cried. I worked evenings at a clinic reception desk, took classes in the mornings, and later transferred to a state university where I finished a legal studies program while waiting tables on weekends. I paid for every bit of it. That matters because by 27, I had built a life the way somebody builds a shelter in bad weather, one piece at a time, with no help and no applause. I worked at a downtown estates firm, and I was good at it. I drafted the boring documents that decide who gets what after somebody's gone. Trusts, distributions, beneficiary language, release forms, all the dry little pages that end up controlling entire families. The joke in my life was that I could protect strangers better than I could protect myself. I could tell a widow exactly what she was owed and exactly what she wasn't. I could read legal fine print like it was plain speech, but when it came to my own family, I could never quite ask to be wanted. The only person in that house who ever made me feel like I was a whole person was my grandmother. Every Sunday at 5 o'clock, like clockwork, I called Eloise Lang. She was my father's mother, and she was the only adult in that family who ever acted like I mattered without attaching a condition to it. She was blunt, she was sharp, she had no patience for nonsense, and she loved harder than anyone else in that family ever bothered to. When I was 13 and crying in her kitchen because my cousin Nolan had told me I didn't count as a real long, she put the dish towel down, lifted my chin with 2 fingers, and said something I never forgot. "You were chosen, sweetheart," she told me. "You weren't picked up and kept. You were chosen." Then she made me a sandwich and let me stay up too late watching old movies. She died when I was 25. 2 years before that dinner, I gave the only speech at her funeral that talked about who she was instead of what she left behind. And not long after the funeral, my parents quietly moved out of the small place they'd been renting and into the bigger house on Hazelmere Drive, the one that had been in Eloise's name for years. I didn't think too much about it then. I was grieving. I was just trying to breathe. But there was one thing my grandmother said to me on one of our last calls, her voice thin and tired over the phone, that I didn't understand until much later. "You'll never have to beg anyone for your own life," she told me. At the time, I thought she meant it as comfort. It turned out she meant it literally, in writing and notarized. About a year before I turned 27, my family started getting strange around me. Not openly cruel, just colder. Messages that used to come back in an hour now took days. My mother stopped including me in holiday plans and then acted surprised when I didn't magically know what to bring to Thanksgiving. My Aunt Sandra got louder in the group chat, using a word she'd never really leaned on before. Blood. As in, this weekend is for blood only. As in, the cabin only sleeps 6 and we're keeping it blood this year. I understood exactly what she was doing. I just didn't know yet why the whole family had gone from mildly distant to strangely coordinated. Families drift, sure, but this wasn't drifting. This was planned. Then, one evening in February, my phone lit up with my mother's name, and her voice was almost too sweet when I answered. "Sweetheart," she said, and she only ever used that tone when she wanted something. "We'd like to take you out and celebrate your birthday properly this year." The second she said it, every alarm I had went off. Most people think cruelty has to be loud. It doesn't. Cruelty can sound like a woman who never once bought you a real birthday cake, suddenly suggesting a fancy restaurant and calling it love. My mother only got generous when there was a reason she could explain to herself later, so I said yes in the soft, obedient voice she expected. Then I hung up and sat at my kitchen table for a long time, trying to piece it all together. I thought about Hazelmere Drive. I thought about the group chat. I thought about the sentence my grandmother had said before she died. And I thought about the folder already sitting in my work bag, the one I'd assembled 6 months earlier for a reason that had nothing to do with my mother and everything to do with finally finding out where I came from. I didn't call my parents back. I didn't ask questions. I didn't warn them I'd been through records. I made a few calls of my own, quiet ones, the kind you make when you've decided you're not going to be trapped. You're going to be ready. I won't tell you yet who I called, but I will tell you the rule I'd learned from Eloise, even if she never said it directly. When my mother got sweet, somebody at the table was about to lose something. This time, it was not going to be me. A lot of people assume this story is about money. I get why. There was a house, there were documents, there was a folder sliding across a table. But sitting in my car outside Ellery House that night, hands steady on the steering wheel, I wasn't scared of losing a number. I was scared of losing the last piece of myself that still believed I had ever belonged there. Because no matter how cold that house had been, no matter how transactional every birthday, every holiday, every quiet little sacrifice had felt, it was still the only origin story I had. They were still technically my parents. And if they cut that thread tonight, the way I thought they were about to, then I would be exactly what my cousin had called me when I was 13. Not really one of them. That wound was the one they were aiming for, and they knew it because they'd spent my whole life pressing on it. What they didn't know was that the wound had already started to close. 6 months can do that when the right people find you. I checked my reflection in the visor mirror, picked up the folder, and walked across the parking lot with the calm of someone who had already read the ending. I wasn't walking into an ambush. I was walking into a goodbye I'd already chosen. They just didn't know it yet. We ordered drinks before anybody said anything real. My mother talked about the wine list like she was doing me a favor by being seen in public with me. My father told a story about traffic he'd already told twice in the car. Then, somewhere between the bread and the untouched appetizer, Marlene folded her hands and switched into that polished voice she used when she was about to say something that was meant to sound reasonable. "We've always done our best for you," she said. Grant nodded along half a beat later, the way he always nodded behind her. "We gave you a home. We gave you an education, more than a lot of kids ever get." I let her keep going. My hand rested flat against the folder beside my plate, and I noticed my father glancing down at it, then away, then back again. The tab was labeled, and the top edge of the label was just visible. If he read the first few letters, he would have known there was something in there he didn't control. I covered the rest with my thumb, not to hide it exactly, just to let him wonder. My mother kept talking about sacrifice, about what raising a child costs, about how people should understand the burden of love. I sat there thinking about a grocery store cupcake and a single candle. Then she paused, took one small sip of wine, set the glass down with the kind of precise motion that tells you a person has rehearsed this, and delivered the line that opened the whole night. "There's something you should have been told a long time ago, Tessa." She looked right at me. "You're adopted." She said it like she was announcing a schedule change. "We brought you home when you were a baby," she went on. "You were never actually ours biologically. I need you to understand that we didn't plan to hide it forever." She watched my face like she was waiting for collapse. The whole evening had been built for that exact moment. The fancy restaurant, the careful clothing, the fake warmth, the silence between my parents. They wanted me shocked, hurt, broken. They wanted me to crumble in front of them so they could walk out feeling justified. I won't lie and say it didn't hit me. It did, but I'd had 6 months to learn the truth already. What my mother revealed that night wasn't that I was adopted. It was how little she knew about me. She leaned forward, almost tender, and said the sentence that told me everything I needed to know about her. "We only kept you because it helped us." She smiled when she said it. That smile was the thing that finally made the whole picture snap into focus. Not that she was cruel, I already knew that. It was that she had rehearsed the cruelty enough to enjoy how it landed. And just like that, I saw it. I hadn't been a disappointing daughter. I had been an asset. My father, to his own shame, tried to explain it like he was balancing a ledger. "There were support payments at first," he said, still not quite looking at me. "When you were younger, there was a small monthly amount tied to the adoption. It ended a long time ago, back when you were still in school. There were tax advantages, too. And your grandmother—" He stopped, swallowed, and tried again. "Eloise believed in family obligations. Taking you in helped satisfy what she wanted. It was useful for a long time." I sat there and let the arithmetic of my childhood rearrange itself in my head. The one cupcake. The used clothes from my cousin. The heat in my room always being lower than everyone else's. They hadn't been struggling. They'd been collecting the difference between what raising me cost and what having me produced. I had been the source of the income. "We invested in you," Grant said, like that fixed everything, as if I had been an appliance or a rental property. Then my mother got tired of his careful talk and cut straight to the point she had clearly been saving for the end. "The support ended years ago, Tessa. And now that you're 27, there's nothing else being your parents does for us." She said it with the same tone somebody might use to mention a subscription had expired. "You're not useful anymore." 2 sentences. That was all it took for them to reduce my whole life to a line on a spreadsheet. I reached for my water. My hand didn't shake. I noticed that, and I held on to it. Then my father did the thing he had clearly come there to do. He opened the leather portfolio he'd brought and slid a thin stack of papers across the table until it touched my plate. "We've already filed," he said, "so this is clean. You won't be in our will. You won't be listed on any of our accounts or distributions. We wanted to handle it face to face." He said face to face like it was noble. I looked down at the first page, and I saw it immediately. They had filed against the wrong thing. They'd spent money trying to cut me out of an estate that barely mattered, while leaving the actual document untouched, the one that controlled everything, the one they apparently didn't know existed in the form it did. They thought power in that room ran through their own paperwork. They were aiming their neat little knife at the wrong target. I didn't correct them. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let people finish making their mistake. So I slid the papers back an inch and let them keep believing they were winning. Then my Aunt Sandra's voice came through the speakerphone from inside my mother's purse, because apparently she'd been listening the whole time. "Blood looks after blood," she said, in that fake warm voice she used when she was trying to sound wise. "You've always understood that." I didn't cry. I know people expected me to. Some younger version of me probably had been bracing for this exact table since the day my cousin told me I didn't count. But the woman sitting there at 27 just took a slow drink of water and set the glass down without a sound. And that's when I saw something on my mother's face I had never seen before. Not anger, disappointment. Not at me, at the fact that I wasn't playing the part she'd written for me. She'd planned for tears. She'd planned for me to beg or collapse or at least get loud. Instead, I sat still and watched her story stop working. "Say something," she snapped. I looked at her and considered all the things I could say. Every sentence I'd been swallowing for 27 years was lined up behind my teeth. Then she made the mistake people like her always make. She tried the same line again, expecting it to hurt more the second time. "We only kept you because it helped us," she repeated, slower, like she could force it deeper if she pressed hard enough. But a sentence loses a lot of power when you hear it twice from the same mouth. The first time it had been a shock. The second time it was just a confession, and not about me. I smoothed my napkin in my lap and looked straight ahead. Behind my mother, at table 14, a woman with my exact chin turned her head toward us and went still. To explain what was in my folder, I have to go back 6 months to the week 2 envelopes arrived and changed everything. After Eloise died, I finally registered with the State Adoption Reunion Registry. I figured nothing would happen. I was just trying to do something with the ache. Then, about 7 weeks later, a letter showed up in careful handwriting I didn't recognize. It was from a woman named Clara Wren. She wrote that she had been 18 when she gave me up, that she had never wanted to, that she thought about me every spring on the same date and had done so for 27 years. She said that if I ever wanted to meet her, she would come wherever I needed her to be. At the bottom, she had added one sentence that I read over and over until the paper felt soft in my hands. "I never stopped saving you a place." 3 days later, another envelope came. This one wasn't from Clara. Our state had recently opened original birth records to adult adoptees, and I'd filed for mine through the same system. While I was waiting, I also requested the estate file for Eloise, professional instinct, the kind of thing I do without thinking. That was the envelope that changed the whole math. Inside was the trust summary for the Eloise Lang Family Trust, created 2 years before she died and administered by a bank. The caregiver distributions to Grant and Marlene Lang, it said, would end when the beneficiary turned 27, and the remainder would pass to my granddaughter, Tessa. Not to them, to me. Held by a trustee they couldn't touch, scheduled to release on the exact birthday they had chosen for that dinner. One envelope told me where I came from. The other told me exactly what my parents were about to lose. I didn't call and scream. That was never the plan. I work in this field. I know how often a dramatic reaction gets turned into a problem later. What I had was paperwork, so I used paperwork. I took a personal day, brought the documents to an estates attorney who had nothing to do with my family, and paid her myself to confirm what I already suspected. She did. The caregiver distributions were real, ongoing, and ending. My parents had been receiving monthly support for years, living in the house funded by Eloise's trust, and collecting what they could while I was growing up. On my 27th birthday, the remainder was scheduled to pass to me through the corporate trustee. Nothing they signed, filed, or tore up could stop it. Their will didn't matter. Their disownment was theater staged on the wrong set. My attorney asked if I wanted to warn them, or maybe soften it. I said no. I asked her for 3 things in a folder: the retainer letter, so they'd know I had counsel; the trust distribution schedule, so they could see the date in black and white; and my original birth certificate, with Clara Wren listed as my mother, so there would be no confusion about which family was about to keep me and which one had already lost me. I carried that folder for 6 months like a live wire I hadn't turned on yet. The dinner invitation was just the signal. I met Clara for the first time at a diner halfway between our cities because she said she didn't want me driving all the way to her. That tiny kindness nearly broke me more than any speech could have. She was nervous. She kept touching the edge of a photo album she'd brought, but not opening it all the way, like she was afraid she didn't have the right. She had my face in the same strange places, my mouth when I was trying not to cry, my habit of going very still when I was overwhelmed. Over the next 6 months, we built something slow and careful, the way you repair a broken bridge while still standing on it. I learned I had a half-brother named Mateo, who was 22 and had no filter at all. He started texting me memes a week after we met, like that was completely normal and not one of the most comforting things anyone had ever done for me. I learned my birth grandmother June was tiny, blunt, and fearless. The first time she saw me, she put her hand on her hip and said, "Well, there you are," like I'd just been late, not gone for 27 years. They never asked me for anything. No money, no favors, no performance. The third time I saw Clara, she told me the line that ended up becoming the truest thing I've ever heard. "We've kept a place for you," she said. "Nobody else has sat in it." I sat there in that little diner booth staring at my hands because I knew how to draft a beneficiary clause for someone else's life, but I had no idea what to do with people who wanted me without getting anything in return. After 27 years of being useful, I didn't know how to be welcomed. I was about to have to learn fast. There's a huge difference between being needed and being wanted. I only ever knew one of those. Being needed is simple. It has rules. You show up, you do what's expected, you stay agreeable, and in return, you get to remain useful. I understood that completely. What Clara, Mateo, and June offered me had no job attached to it, and that scared me more than my mother ever had. The first time Clara called just to ask how my week was, with no hidden reason behind it, I sat there waiting for the catch the entire conversation. There wasn't one. When we hung up, I had to pull my car over because I couldn't see well enough to keep driving. I kept testing them in ways I'm not proud of. I'd cancel plans just to see if they'd get angry. They didn't. They'd say, "No problem, next time." I'd offer to pay for everything because I didn't know how to be in a relationship without buying my seat. June finally took my hands in hers the way Eloise used to and said, "Baby, you don't have to earn a chair here. It's already yours." That was the moment something inside me loosened. Not fixed, just loosened. I started to believe, in spite of 27 years of evidence, that somebody could actually want me in the room. So when my mother called to ask if I wanted to be celebrated properly this year, I already knew where I wanted to spend my birthday. I just decided to be in two places at once. Here's who I called. The night my mother made the reservation, I called Clara and asked a question I'd never asked anybody in my life. "Would you come to my birthday dinner?" I told her everything. The parents, the weird timing, the trust, the papers, the speech I could feel coming. I told her I didn't know exactly what they were going to say, but I knew I didn't want to sit through it alone. And I knew I wasn't interested in performing pain for their benefit anymore. Clara didn't even pause. "Tell me when and where," she said. "Should we dress up?" Then she said something that made me actually put a hand over my mouth in my kitchen. "We'd be honored to show up for you," she said, "and to let you not need them." Then I made one more call. I booked a second table at Ellery House for the same night, under my own name, Tessa Lang, party of 3. Table 14, the host told me, 3 tables behind the Mercer reservation. I almost laughed out loud at how neat the layout was. They had no idea they were about to try to disown me in plain view of the people who had spent the last 6 months teaching me what being wanted feels like. I told Clara, Mateo, and June to arrive a little after I did, to sit quietly, to order what they wanted, to let me come to them when I was ready. I'm not going to pretend I didn't want them there. I did. There's something about having witnesses when the truth is going to hit the fan, and I knew a private confrontation would just become my mother's word against mine later. So yes, I wanted witnesses. I wanted them badly. But Clara, Mateo, and June weren't just witnesses to me. They were proof. That folder was how I planned to show my parents they had already lost. Table 14 was where I'd remember I had won, long before they sat down. Back at the front table, my mother decided the silence had gone long enough and tried to close the deal. She pulled one more page from my father's portfolio, turned it toward me, and set a pen on top of it like she was doing me a favor. "It's just acknowledgement," she said. "All it says is that we told you. Sign it, and we can have a civilized dinner and move on." I looked at the page. I didn't even need to read much of it. The language was textbook, a clean little release form pretending to be an acknowledgement. The kind of paper someone uses when they want you to agree while still in shock that you don't have anything to challenge. I'd seen that kind of thing plenty of times in my job. They wanted my signature before the shock wore off and before I had time to think. Classic move. My mother was counting on the wound she thought she'd just opened. She had no idea it came with a trust attached to it. I didn't touch the pen. My father kept glancing at my folder, and I watched panic rise in his face in slow motion. Grant had always been the one who actually understood where money lived. He saw enough of the tab label to know there was something in there he didn't control. Then he finally spoke. "Is there something we're missing?" he asked, and even he sounded unsure now. "Tessa, is there something we should know?" I gave him the first real smile I'd shown all night. "Not yet," I said. That was when my Aunt Sandra arrived in person with my cousin Nolan right behind her. Both of them acted like they'd only just wandered in from the bar, though I knew perfectly well they'd been waiting for the signal. "Wow, what a coincidence," Sandra said, leaning in to kiss my cheek. Right away, I understood my mother had called in backup. She always liked an audience when she was doing something cruel, especially if the audience would help pressure me into behaving. Sandra pulled out a chair without asking. Nolan, now 30 and still dressed like a teenager with money, gave me the same look he'd given me as a kid, the look that said I was always going to wind up at the wrong end of the family table. Sandra didn't bother with subtlety. "We're all just trying to do what's best for this family," she said, setting a hand over my mother's. "And families have to make difficult choices about who really belongs. You've always been practical, Tessa. You understand that blood looks after blood." There was that word again, blood. The same word she'd been feeding into the group chat all year finally showed up out loud at the table built around it. And in that second, I felt the last chain of obligation inside me loosen. These weren't people I was losing. They were people I was putting down. I had carried them long enough. Across from me, my father wasn't joining in. He was staring at his hands like they might answer him. Then, while Sandra was still talking, Grant leaned slightly toward me and said something low enough that only I could hear. "For what it's worth," he said, "your grandmother loved you." He stopped there. For a second, I saw the version of my father who might have existed if he had ever once chosen the harder thing. His eyes were wet. He did love his mother. I believed that. And I think some part of him understood that Eloise had built this whole financial wall around me because she didn't trust him to protect me on his own. That must have been a miserable thing to sit with. I waited for the next sentence. I really did. There was a version of that night where he said he was sorry, where he stood up, where he told my mother this was wrong and he wouldn't do it. If he had, I would have heard him. It would have mattered. But he looked at my mother, who was watching him like a handler watching a dog near traffic, and I saw him choose. He leaned back, picked up his glass, and the almost apology died in his throat the same way all his almost decisions always had. That was the closest thing to love anybody at the front table gave me all night. 4 words and a swallow. I didn't hate him for it. You can't really hate somebody for being exactly the weight you always knew they were. But I understood something then. The reason they had rushed this night. The reason they were pressing so hard for my signature. The reason my mother had gone with such theatrical sweetness. They knew the date was coming. My father knew about Eloise's trust. He had known the whole time, and he'd hoped to get me to sign away whatever claim I had before I learned what his mother had actually done for me. So I asked him a question, not loudly, not emotionally. I asked it the way I would ask a client when I'd found the problem in their paperwork and wanted to give them the chance to notice it themselves. "Dad," I said, "which document did you actually file under, your estate or Grandma Eloise's trust?" The table changed instantly. My mother froze with her glass halfway up. Sandra's hand stopped in the middle of patting my mother's arm. Grant blinked at me like I'd just spoken a language he half remembered but never really knew. In 8 words, I had told them 3 things. I knew there was a difference. I knew which one mattered. And I had known long enough to learn the language of both. None of them had ever heard me sound like that before. To them, I had always been the easy one, the quiet one, the one who took the smaller piece so nobody got uncomfortable. They had built the whole night around the assumption that I would receive my fate. They never expected me to audit it. "What are you talking about?" my mother demanded, but her voice had already lost its shape. I let the question sit there. I've learned something very useful in life. The person who doesn't hurry is often the one controlling the room. Then I turned my water glass slightly and lined it up with the edge of my folder. My father had gone pale. He knew. He knew exactly what was about to happen, and I could tell he wanted me not to open the folder. Too late. I didn't make a show of it. No dramatic flourish. No slammed papers. I just opened the folder and laid the 3 pages out on the tablecloth, one by one. First, the retainer letter from my attorney. Second, the trust distribution schedule. Third, my original birth certificate. I didn't point. I let the documents speak for themselves. My mother's eyes went to the trust page first, because of course they did. People like her always know where the money sleeps. She read it. I watched the words land. The caregiver distributions to Grant and Marlene Lang shall terminate upon the beneficiary's 27th birthday, whereupon the remainder shall pass to my granddaughter, Tessa. I watched her get to the words remainder and Tessa, and I watched the color drain from her face like a shade being pulled down. Then she looked at me, then at Grant, then back at the page, as if the second reading might somehow change the meaning. It didn't. "Marlene," I said softly, because I could afford to be soft now. "You filed against the wrong family. The one you tried to cut me out of was never the one with the real money." My mother was quick, I'll give her that. It took her maybe 10 seconds to fully understand what had happened, but I watched it happen in real time. The house on Hazelmere Drive, which had been funded through the trust she assumed would carry her forever. The monthly distributions that had quietly supported her life and were ending tonight by the trust's own terms. The actual remainder, the part she'd spent decades circling but never controlling, passing to the daughter she had just told she was no longer useful. And the waiver she had so confidently put in front of me? Worthless. It would have released a claim on an estate that was never where the value lived. She had aimed every weapon at the wrong target. The cruelty had been cheap. The mistake had been expensive. Here's the other thing I learned about my mother that night. People like her never apologize when they're caught. They pivot. Her face changed fast. The cold went away, and a warm, trembling expression took over. Then she reached across the table for my hand. "Tessa," she said, and suddenly her voice was soft and wet and almost motherly in a way it had never been when it cost her anything. "We're still your parents. Whatever those papers say, that doesn't change what we are. We're family." Family. From the same mouth that had said not 20 minutes earlier that they only kept me because I was useful. I looked at her hand and didn't take it. People always expect the dramatic version of this story, the one where I start naming numbers and force them to sit there and squirm. I get why people want that. It's satisfying. But I'm in this world professionally, and I can tell you something important. The strongest position in any room isn't the one with the most money. It's the one that doesn't need the money at all. I had a career I built myself. I had savings. I had a life that existed without them. I did not need Eloise's remainder to walk away free. And that, more than anything, was what my mother could not survive understanding. So I closed the folder. I gathered the pages back inside it, calm as ever, and I set the pen they'd brought for my surrender neatly beside her plate. I had already won the thing they thought we were fighting over, before they even sat down. There wasn't anything left to argue about. There was only one choice left: where I was going to spend the rest of my birthday. I had made that choice 6 months earlier, in a vinyl booth with a woman who had my chin and a nervous smile, and a photo album she didn't know if she was allowed to open. If someone only shows up when you're useful, you already know what that is. It isn't love. If you've had to learn that the hard way, drop the word boundaries in the comments. And if this story hits home, stay with me. I stood up, just like that, no speech, no drama, just a woman pushing back her chair and picking up her folder. But the reaction at the front table was immediate. My mother's hand was still hanging in the air where mine should have been. "Sit down," she snapped, and the sweet mask dropped away so fast it was almost ugly. "Sit down right now, Tessa. Where do you think you're going?" Sandra straightened in her chair. Nolan stopped smirking for the first time all night. My father just looked tired in that awful way men look when they know they've let something good get away from them. I pulled the folder against my chest and looked at my mother, who had spent 27 years trying to teach me I had no real place anywhere. Then I told her as plainly as I could, "My birth family is 3 tables behind you." I didn't say it cruelly. I didn't need to. It had been true the entire night, true while she smiled, true while she rehearsed, true while she slid that waiver in front of me. She had thought she was disowning me in front of strangers, but she'd been doing it within arm's reach of the people who had spent months saving me a chair. I watched the words hit her, and then I watched my mother start to turn around, slowly, like some part of her already knew and the rest of her was begging to be wrong. Her shoulders shifted, her face followed, and at table 14, 3 tables back, were Clara, June, and Mateo, who had been there the whole time, quietly eating, quietly waiting, quietly watching my parents do the worst thing they could imagine. Clara looked up first. She didn't glare, she didn't smirk. She just looked at the woman who had raised her daughter on 1 candle and a calculator. Then she looked at me, and her whole face softened. June already had her napkin folded in her lap, like she was prepared for anything. Mateo had stopped pretending to stare at his phone. My mother's eyes moved from Clara's face to mine and back again, and I saw the exact moment she understood. The family she told me I didn't have was sitting in real chairs, in the same room, watching her. She turned back toward me and opened her mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in my entire life, my mother had no script. And in the silence where her next cruel sentence should have been, a chair scraped back at table 14. They all stood, not to start a scene, not to fight, just to be on their feet when I crossed the room toward them, the way people stand when someone they love is coming home. June stood first, because June always moved first. Then Clara, then Mateo, nearly knocking his knee against the table in his rush. They didn't say a single word to my parents. They didn't have to. Their silence said enough. The whole restaurant had gone quiet, the kind of quiet where people know something real is happening and stop pretending not to notice. A server froze in the aisle with a tray. Somebody at the bar put down a drink and just watched. And I walked past my mother, who was still half-turned in her chair, past Sandra, whose mouth had finally run out of the word blood, past my father, who lifted his eyes to me and then dropped them again. 3 tables, 27 years, 15 feet. When I got to table 14, June took my face in both hands the way Eloise used to. Clara pulled out the empty seat beside her, the 4th chair they'd asked for, even though the reservation was only for 3, and said the words she had written in that first letter. "We saved you a place," she said. "We always did." And I sat down in it, in the chair that had been waiting my whole life, at the table that wanted me before it even knew me. That was when my mother lost the one thing she had never lost in public before: control. I heard her chair scrape back. I heard her rise. I heard the calm she'd worn all evening finally crack right down the middle. "After everything we paid for," she said, and now her voice carried through the whole restaurant. "The schools, the roof, the years. You do this to us in public? You humiliate your own family over money?" People were openly staring now. One man at the bar turned fully around. Sandra tugged at my mother's sleeve and hissed for her to sit down, but she was beyond listening. For the first time in her life, the script was gone, and all she had left was the truth coming out sideways. "We gave you everything," she said to a room full of strangers, and even then, even at the very end, she said gave, not loved. I stayed seated at table 14. I didn't rise to match her. I didn't raise my voice. Clara's hand had found mine under the table, and I let my mother be loud because it was doing the work for me. Everybody in that restaurant could see exactly what was happening. A woman screaming about everything she'd paid for, and a younger woman sitting calmly with people who clearly adored her. There is no human being who hears a parent shout about money and thinks, "Yes, that's love." My father never stood up. He just put his face in his hands. I let my mother run out of air the way a storm runs out of rain. Then, when the room went quiet again, I did one last thing before giving my real attention back to the people who actually wanted me. I stood, walked back to the front table, and set one page down in front of her. The trust schedule. Face up. I didn't need it anymore. My attorney had the originals. I wanted her to have something to stare at on the longest night of her life. "You can keep this copy," I told her. "You'll want to understand what ended tonight and what didn't." She stared at the page. My father reached for it and then stopped. I looked at both of them. My mother, who had priced me at 1 cupcake. My father, who had loved his mother enough to know better and not enough to act on it. Then I gave them the line I'd already rehearsed in my head while sitting in the parking lot. "You kept me because I was useful," I said. Then I turned away, and I walked back to table 14 without looking behind me once. Not when Sandra called my name. Not when my mother said something I couldn't hear. Not even then. When I sat back down, June had already ordered me a slice of chocolate cake, and Mateo had stuck a single candle in it. 1 candle. The symmetry of it caught in my throat for a second. Then Clara leaned in and said, "Blow it out, baby. make your wish. And I realized I didn't have one. I already had the thing I'd spent my whole life waiting for. Eloise's trust did exactly what she built it to do. On my 27th birthday, the caregiver distributions to Grant and Marlene ended right on schedule, just like she'd written years before she died. The remainder passed to me through the bank trustee, untouched by the will my parents had tried to rewrite, because you cannot disinherit someone from a trust you don't control. Their waiver, unsigned, was worth exactly nothing. Within a year, my parents sold Hazelmere Drive because without the distributions, they couldn't keep it. They moved somewhere smaller. I heard Sandra was furious when she realized none of Eloise's money was going to Nolan either. The story spread the way family stories do, first through relatives, then past them. And the version where Marlene Lang was the wounded, devoted mother, betrayed by an ungrateful adopted daughter, never really took hold. Too many people at Ellery House had seen the whole thing. Too many witnesses watched a woman shout about what she'd paid for, while I sat quietly holding hands with the people across the room who actually loved me. I never sued anybody. I never posted about it. I just stopped answering. I let the silence do what it was supposed to do. My father texted me once, a few weeks later. Just 3 words. I'm sorry. No name, no explanation. I didn't reply. Later, I heard that when Sandra tried to rally everybody into contesting Eloise's trust, Grant was the one who finally shut it down. He told them their mother had every right to leave her money wherever she wanted, that it was hers, that it was over. He was right. He was also, as always, too late and saying it in the wrong room. That was my father in the end, a man who knew the right thing, maybe even felt it, but could only say it once it no longer cost him anything. I didn't need the apology, but I was glad he'd finally managed to say something honest out loud. As for me, I spent that first real birthday eating chocolate cake at table 14 with people who got nothing from wanting me. And I've spent every birthday since with them. Clara and I talk every Sunday now at 5 o'clock, the hour I used to keep for Eloise. June taught me how to make grilled cheese the right way. Mateo still sends stupid memes at random. And in a drawer in my new family's kitchen, there's a photo album that doesn't really close anymore because it finally has enough pictures in it. Being useful was all my parents ever asked from me. Being wanted was the thing I never had. And it took me 27 years and one brutal dinner to learn that anybody who only keeps you for the benefits has already told you, as plainly as possible, that they were never your family at all. That's my story. One candle for all those years, and on the 27th birthday, a whole table lit them all without being asked. If somebody in your life only values you when you're useful, maybe this is your sign to stop auditioning for a seat you already deserve. You do not have to earn the people who truly love you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if this hit home, drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time.